The last tab is Project Environment, and it basically says when conditions become non-conducive for growth in our environment and Washington cannot be influenced any further, the weather is lacking any precipitation. It should be wet. And the phrase wet implies blood and implies assassination. So this is a direct statement that Kennedy should be assassinated.
And I might further add that the context was around Kennedy wanting to share more information with the Russians about UFOs and what they call unknowns. And there's both a leaked document that talks about this, a part of the MJ-12 document, but there's also a document from the National Archives, a NASAM Memorandum 271 or 273 that that talks about Kennedy wanting to share more information with the Russians, and that may be one of many reasons why he might have been assassinated.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Wood and Ryan Wood to Exopolitics Today. Both of them have quite an accomplishment in terms of their establishment of the Majestic Documents website and several books and a lot of material casting light on the UFO phenomenon from the perspective of leaked official documents. So welcome both of you to the show.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, Michael.
Well, Bob, I'd like to begin with you, and that is you retired from McDonnell Douglas after a 43-year career with both Douglas and McDonnell Douglas aircraft companies. And so soon after your retirement, I think it was around 1994, you began to work on the Majestic Documents, or you were given some leaked documents to authenticate. So can you walk us through exactly what happened?
Well, actually, I retired in 1993 in October. And in early 1994, I got a call from Stan Friedman, with whom I'd been a colleague in the past, saying that he had received a copy of a document that was potentially interesting. Was I interested in assessing it? And I said, definitely yes. And so he worked it out so that I was able to meet with Don Berliner, who had this copy of Psalm 101. And I went and through Washington and went with Don Berliner to a photographic shop where he watched over the process of actually making high quality copies of this document. And towards the end, there was a couple pages at the front we couldn't really see very well, so we copied those too, and it turned out those were the control pages, and that turned out to be important later. But this was the process that started me actually becoming more involved after I retired in authenticating the Psalm 101.
Thanks. So, so Ryan, I mean, how did you get interested in investigating UFO documents? Because I know you actually have worked as an engineer or in that industry. So, why did you kind of make this move into studying and authenticating these controversial documents?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wonder myself how it all happened. But I'd say the seed was planted when I was a 15-year-old, and Stan Friedman came to dinner one time and talked about what he was doing at Douglas Aircraft Company for my father, or McDonnell Douglas at the time, on reverse engineering UFOs. But that's a longer story for later. But I was curious about the topic, sort of as an investigator, as an analyst, and sort of ignored it for the majority of my 20s and 30s. And it wasn't really until, I mean, I went to a few UFO conferences, but when my dad got the Special Operations Manual in '94 and began to retype it, and we began to talk to Tim Cooper and his trove of documents, it became far more interesting and engaging, that there was something spectacular here. But my professional business career has been as an engineer and a scientist, and in semiconductors and computers, in aerospace, and now in energy and fusion energy.
Well, yes, those interests are something that is quite relevant to some of the Majestic documents, especially when we're talking about some of the propulsion and energy systems of these. Now, some of the documents actually do talk about novel types of propulsion and energy systems. So was that something that particularly drew your attention?
Well, to some extent, yes. At the time, it looked like good material to try to authenticate when you have specific elements and written commentary about this neutronic power plant that was in the White Hot report. There was a reference to something obscure called NE-102, which we said, well, what's that? Why is that even relevant here? And when you find it in the junkyards of Los Alamos, and it's an perfectly appropriate term for something that's, in the late 40s timeframe, but obscure and irrelevant now today, or even in '94, it added a check mark of authenticity to that particular document that was around, the description of this propulsion power plant.
And by the White Hot report, of course, you're talking about one of these leaked documents that describes the incidents that surrounded the Roswell 1947 crash. So, do you kind of like want to give people more detail? Because I know there's a lot of people in my audience that know very little about the Majestic documents, and some of these documents are, very significant with to their content. So do either one of you want to just tell us what is the White Hot report and why is that important?
Yeah. Well, I'll take a stab at it, and then Bob can finish it off. Okay. So it's, I think, dated September 23rd, 1947, and it's a report to Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, sort of a summary of the investigation and reverse engineering analysis around the crashed UFOs in, the White Sands area, AKA Roswell, and potentially others. Is not completely clear at that time, but in the basic effort, the preliminary effort to understand what was going on with these crashed UFOs in New Mexico. And it's a 23-page report that describes their process, what they did, what they learned. Dad, you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I want to point out that that's just one of the number of reports that we received from Timothy Cooper. I have a folder here that I keep in the safe that has the Burned Memo report that is significant for other reasons. But the first event that I believe started Brian and me on a joint activity looking at the Majestic documents was when we were invited to give a joint presentation at the end of 1995 or so back east. And it was a dual thing. That is, he talked and I talked, and basically at the end of this presentation, which was on the authenticity of Psalm 101. We had Linda Moulton Howe get up and publicly state that this was the first time that they'd heard anything that was the equivalent of real evidence that these were authentic. And that kind of started Ryan and me on our what you call mini fame, and resulted in a few years later in getting a phone call from Joe Firmage, who wound up giving us a lot of money to authenticate the reports.
Yeah, yeah.
And so go ahead.
Well, it was John White's Connecticut UFO conference. It was the last year, the 10th year, and it was a fun, our first joint conference, first time really going to a UFO conference of consequence.
So SOM 101 stands for Special Operations Manual, and that deals with instructions for crash retrieval operations. And I mean, it really is an explosive document. I mean,
yes,
and there's been so much debate over it. So do you want to kind of like just maybe give listeners or viewers a little bit of a description of the contents of this document?
Should I start?
Yeah, you can start. I'll finish.
Well, as I said, we got a call from Joe Firmage, and the net result was that he gave us quite a bit of money, and he offered to pay for 2,000 copies of the Special Operations Manual. And here is one of the copies that he wound up paying for. That's the original. But Ryan and I, in 2003 or so, felt that it needed some explanation and clarification. And so Ryan and I printed this version, which has a great deal of information in the rear that supports the authenticity of the documents themselves, as well as explains the rationale of why the Special Operations Manual was printed and created to begin with.
Yeah. Some of the contents, to talk to your question, Michael, more directly, was, they talk about recovery operations in a very practical way, how to pack things up, where to package the bodies, where to send the power plant stuff, how to crate it. I gave a couple of descriptions of the types of what they call extraterrestrial biological entities, or EBEs or EBINs. And had type 1 and type 2, which are descriptions of sort of the typical gray and a more Chinese looking, short stature alien as well. There was all sorts of identification guides and other information, but it's a fairly robust and detailed document that's typeset on a hot lead printing press, and has a lot of indications that the materials are directly sent to Area 51 S4 with appropriate markings on the crates and so forth. So that's really the contents. There's so much detail, there's so much information, there's so many words and so many elements to analyze and check that it was really a golden opportunity to dig in and understand the authenticity of this document and prove to ourselves that it was genuine.
I know you actually, both of you developed a pretty rigorous set of criteria for evaluating and authenticating these documents. So how well did the Special Operations Manual stand up to your rigorous investigation and verification?
Well, when I first got it, I visited the public printer with this classified top secret document.
Yeah, we both did.
Well, yes, we both did, but I think I went alone by myself the first time. And we talked to this public printer, McCarter, who actually had a job of running some of these machines in that particular time. So he looked at the document for quite a while, and after 10 minutes of looking at it, he concluded that, well, he said, based on the content, he said, I say it's fake. However, if I look at the raised Z's that I see here, that I know that that was printed on that printing press, probably the same one that I personally used. And he identified the type font that was used, and showed that the raised Z's occurred because when the rarely used letter Z was put down by the little crud on the back, and it didn't seat properly. So that's why they were raised sometimes. And so the raised Z's together with later, we found that there were a couple of words that were critical in the point of the time, and in particular, the word first aid were initial caps, and then later they became just one word.
Right, along with screwdriver and other etymology that's obscure for the era.
Right.
The other thing that I did was to focus on, what the FBI does is, well, where'd you get it? What's the provenance of this document? And you could say, well, it's undeveloped film mailed from Wisconsin and the Quillen Pharmacy. Shortly before, there was the Oshkosh fly-in from around the world that's been going around. So the speculation is that somebody flew in and mailed it and then flew out. But or not. But I also, going to Bob's earlier comments about the change control pages, I looked at the initials, the EWL and JRT initials that are in the change control page, and cross-correlated this with the Kirkland, Albuquerque, New Mexico phone book from 1954, 55, 56. And we knew the inside of the manual was stamped Kirkland Air Force Base Unit KB 21, I believe. And I found the initials or the names of these two officers right there on Perimeter Road in the phone book. Both were captains, I believe. One was a lieutenant colonel, one was a captain, I think.
That was a breakthrough.
Yeah, both Air Force officers. And there was no other examples of, JRTs or EWLs in the phone book that, were on the base. I mean, so it seems highly likely that those are the guys. And then subsequently hired a private investigator, maybe 5 years later, to try to hunt down these people. And he found one of them, the EWL one, had passed away and was buried in Florida at a military seminar or cemetery, and his wife confirmed the name, at least, to our investigators, but not his participation in anything alien. But anyway, that was a provenance element of the authenticity effort.
Yeah, that was a nice piece of work that Ryan did all by himself. That basically I had almost nothing to do with. But
so I was going to say, so your efforts were basically to authenticate this leaked government military manual on how to deal with crashed UFOs, and to the best of your knowledge, all of the data corroborated that this was a genuine government official document. So, I mean, the question is, well, then why isn't this something that the mass media hasn't covered? And now that Congress is holding hearings on UAPs or UFOs, you know, could this document be offered as evidence that, in fact, UFOs have been visiting us? Some of them have crashed, and governments or militaries have set up elaborate procedures for dealing with the crashes.
I think that's an intriguing question as to why we can't offer these up as part of the recorded history of the subject.
Well, we sort of did once. I mean, you, Dad, went to the Steve Bassett congressional hearing, mock congressional hearings, and presented this data. And Linda Howe has, on multiple presentations throughout her career and environment, often hold up this manual and say, yeah, this is the best, single most powerful evidence that MJ12 exists. And you can dismiss lots of stuff, but you can't dismiss this.
Yeah.
And no,
yeah, she regularly uses that in their presentations as an example of the kind of authenticity that you'd expect to see.
yeah. So
on that manual and throughout many of the documents that make up the Majestic Documents, there are classifications such as MAGIC, and I know, Bob, you've mentioned that MAGIC may be an acronym for Military Assessment Joint Intelligence Committee. So how did that begin? I mean, how did that classification MAGIC become adopted for a lot of these documents dealing with extraterrestrials and UFO crashes?
Well, I'm not sure I can say how the word magic actually began. Clearly, they wanted to have some special way to separate these from the usual top secret. But I really don't know the details of how that might have happened. I do know that we have a wide variety of specialized classifications, and the higher you go in terms of the clearance level, the more there are. I think that's all I can say there.
I guess I would add that we have a memo that uses the term military assessment of the Joint Intelligence Committee. I think I'm not sure what the date is. Maybe you could look that up, Dad. But I believe it was in 45 or 44, or maybe it was early 47. That seemed like it was logical to use that. I mean, we have the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, which the National Archives has admitted is a real organization, part of the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence in the Air Force, that came sort of out of the OSS and the CIA, and the IPU, Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, which is sort of the precursor of the investigations into crashed UFOs, maybe into the 1941 Cape Girardeau crash, and was the sort of early element. And then as 47 came along and we had more crashes, and then the trove of documents into the late 40s and the Special Operations Manual in 1954, people seem to be using this MJ12, Magic Eyes Only, all these classifications. Now, I would add that the National Archives has said to me, and maybe to Bob as well, that there is no classification magic or top secret magic in our records. So if an archivist or a declassifier at the National Archives got a piece of paper out of Vault 631, which is a huge football field sized vault, that said, I got to review this for declassification, he would look for it against all these various criteria that they have. But top secret is something they deal with all the time, and they have certain rules. But if it says magic on it, they would say, I can't refer this to anybody. It's not the CIA, it's not the Air Force, it's not the Navy, it's not the Marines, it's not, I don't know where to send this. It doesn't exist. So they would look for the usual subjects and then declassify it. So that's interesting of itself, is that there's sort of an official denial from the National Archives. And that conversation and commentary was directly from an archivist that we knew that was interested in the UFO field, that had a job inside declassifying documents at the National Archives, not even a long-term employee.
I know there's one of the documents is the Truman Memo from September 24, 1947, and that talks about, I think it was Operation Majestic, and it was saying that this was an operation that was going to be run by the Secretary of Defense at the time, James Forrestal, and that's often taken as the starting date for the creation of the Majestic 12 or the MJ12 group. So do you want to kind of explain the significance of that particular document that's on the Majestic website?
Well, I think the point I would make is that the point that Ryan just made, that there were earlier crashes in 1941, 40, and also in 42 with the Battle of LA. But the fact that there were earlier crashes kind of set it up to have a process in place that was covert, that would be able to deal with the recovery of these crashes. So I think they'd been thinking about how to set up a classification system for a long time.
Yeah, I'm sure they're thinking about, how to classify. I think that memo was, 42 or so. And there was a memo from Vannevar Bush to FDR that said, I got to deal with the war now. I can't, set up a program to exploit these celestial gifts, and hold off here, guys. And it really took until after the Second World War and more crashes for people to sit up and take notice and say, well, we really need to understand this advanced technology and try to get an advantage over the Soviets.
Well, it had so many different documents taken all together that I think one of the very important things that we did was to put them on a website that is www.majesticdocuments.com. It's a website where anyone can go and look at the details of each of these documents and see not only the document themselves, but also our commentary about the authenticity and credibility of the document.
Right.
Yeah, I think the Majestic Documents website is a real treasure, and I've used it a lot in my research, because you really don't have, if you're trying to understand what has happened historically with this UFO phenomenon, you really don't get a good picture until you consult the Majestic Documents website, because that gives you a fairly good overview. And and this leads to to my next question, which is, so the crash retrieval operations began in 1941 with the Cape Girardeau crash, but it's only in 1947, 6 years later, that the Majestic 12 group is set up to take control of these things. So what do you think there was that delay, 6 years from the time of the first retrieval operation to 47, them actually setting up a committee to actually run the whole thing?
Well, I think it wasn't in a vacuum. The Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit was operational there as part of the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence. And so they were cataloging it, grabbing it, sorting it out. It's just they didn't have enough manpower other than to just capture the evidence. And it really wasn't until Vannevar Bush started pushing at the highest levels of government that he convinced Truman to say, we need to do something about this in a thoughtful and detailed way.
Well, I think it was the Roswell crash and its publicity that caused the government to decide they needed to have a system to really control the information on crash retrievals. Actually, one of the better books on crash retrievals is Ryan's own book, Magic Eyes Only, correct, Ryan?
Yeah, Magic Eyes Only.
Yeah. So, and it deals with, I think 70 or more.
74.
74 crash retrievals throughout the world, mostly in the United States, with a lot of detail on each one of varying amount, but with a credibility factor for each one. So whether it's high likelihood of being accurate or low. And that was the remarkable thing that got everybody's attention about the book.
Yeah. And just, I mean, it's out of print right now and expensive on Amazon. I'm sorry, I'm working on a second edition, but it's not just the 74 that are in this book, published in 2008. But now I have, another 25 crashes in a folder that would be added to this book to bring it over 100. And again, there are varying quality and sophistication, but there's a mountain of data globally that there's been a lot of crashed UFOs. And there's a black hole in Russia and a black hole in China and many other states. They seem to be all across the world. It's not clear in my mind that the political leaders of all countries or most countries have a detailed understanding of what their military industrial intelligence complex has.
So your book, Magic Eyes Only, I think it does a great job in presenting some of the data about these historic UFO crashes. So in terms of the Majestic documents, how important were they in you being able to put together the 74 cases, and you say there's probably another 26 or so that you're still working on?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Michael. The answer is some were right there. I mean, there was a mention of the 1897 crash in Texas, and that took a little digging, and we found Jim Mars and found evidence and newspaper articles, and so that was a lead that was there. And then there was multiple crashes in the documents from the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit reports. So I would say in total, the Majestic documents implied that there were a lot of crashes with the Special Operations Manual, but I think suggested that there were only 5 or 6 that were directly pointed to in the Majestic documents trove.
Well, one of the more recent documents that came over from Heather Wade in 2016, I guess, 17 maybe, had to do with the Aztec crash. And that's one of the crashes that you do have listed. The contents of that document, when properly transcribed, suggest that it was, in fact, a real crash and was important with respect to describing the history of the program. So the content of that 47 pages that came from the DIA, I think we don't have on the website yet. And I think that needs to be considered, because what I did is I took the words on every page and typed them with great accuracy. And it turns out that every single one of them is, every single error is consistent with the error in pronunciation, and able to show there were two different secretaries who typed it because they used different spaces at the beginning of the paragraphs and that sort of thing. So anyway, the work that I did on that, I think, is potentially an example of another one that should be put on our website. The other thing that's important is that the document itself is a kind of a history of the MJ-12 program as of 1989. And so when read from that point of view, it represents a potentially accurate recorded history of some aspects of the MJ-12 program.
Yes, that document, the Defense Intelligence Agency briefing, dated from 1989. It describes the Aztec crash, and what's very interesting about that crash is that it suggests that President Truman actually met with one of the surviving aliens, and that other government officials and military officials met with the surviving alien for up to a year. That was kept at a safe house. So the Aztec 1948 crash seems to be a very important one because it appears to set off a sequence of meetings, official diplomatic meetings between extraterrestrials and government officials, starting with the Truman administration.
It also has some interesting historical aspects in that it does show the signature of Philip Morrison, who was presumably being briefed by this document, possibly to replace Carl Sagan, who was not well. And that story of itself is sort of interesting because many people have speculated what the history of the members of Majestic 12 have been. The original 12 people have now become 12 new people.
Well, that's very pertinent to my next question, which is the Eisenhower briefing document. I mean, that is allegedly a briefing that President Eisenhower had in 1953 as he was or maybe it was late 1952 after he was elected. So he's given this briefing about some of the UFO crashes, and you found that document to be stood up very well to your authentication process, and you gave it the highest level of authenticity. So do you want to explain why that document got such a high level of authenticity and some of its contents?
Is that a question for Ryan or me?
Either of you can start off.
Well, I'll start. Most of the authenticity work for the EBD or Eisenhower briefing document was done by Stan Friedman. Although there are not a lot of checkable facts in that document, if it has the highest authenticity rating, I might knock it down a notch because I don't think it deserves it. However, as I recall, Dad, you found another source or another different copy of it. Maybe that's why it has the highest authenticity rating now, is that we had a secondary source.
Well, we had a source, however, and that source had slightly different words here and there. Furthermore, I think there were a question of whether how many crashes there were and whether the parts were completely retrieved or whether they were ruined. So there were other aspects of inconsistency. So whereas I think that the document taken as a whole was created for the purpose that, as stated, I think some of the details were made different, perhaps intentionally. The people who were involved in the programs, in my opinion, have gone in some cases out of their way to put in false clues that cause confusion for those who are trying to authenticate. And this may be one of those examples. But there are not significant errors in the Eisenhower briefing document, in my opinion. Basically, it tells the story pretty much like it really happened.
I might add a general note about authenticity, is that you look for evidence to show that something is real or accurate or unique, but you also look for signs of fakery, signs that somebody deliberately tried to hide this and figure out who might have tried to do this or what the motivation was for trying to change something or manipulate comments. And in general, as reported by somebody who used to work at the CIA, when I showed him all these documents, he said, Ryan, there's so much smoke here that there really is some fire. And he didn't have any firsthand knowledge, but from an intelligence point of view, there's just so much evidence to say that, oh yeah, there's something really going on here. And we found it difficult to point to specific elements of fakery and manipulation. And in the end, for what cause? For example, this manual here, the Special Operations Manual, why in the world would somebody leak it as a disinformation ploy, for example? And you wouldn't, because it would simply attract massive amounts of foreign counterespionage from the Russians, the Chinese, and from other organizations that would want to understand, wow, the US has alien tech and we don't. And well, that should launch a decades-long effort to penetrate Area 51. And I need to implant spies in Lockheed and EG&G and every other defense contractor that has relationships into that organization and that place. And that's the last thing that the government or the security personnel for the UFO fields or other fields wants, is to have, you know, more espionage targeted around UFOs. They want less. They want to just keep it quiet, keep learning, keep ahead.
This is something maybe you could start off with, Bob, because I know you've done presentations on this particular leaked document, the Burn Memo. I mean, it's an explosive document because it really does appear to be a smoking gun of who was behind the Kennedy assassinations. So do you want to kind of like just explain the Burn Memo and, you know, why it got that name and its contents and why it's so important?
Well, yeah, I could hold it up here for a second. You can see that it is a real memo and it looks like it's been burned. The interesting thing about the first page, it says, please do not remove, by JJA, which is James Jesus Angleton. So clearly it was in the inner circle of the CIA that dealt with it. Basically, it's got a project, it's got 8 different subheadings. And the thing about the memo physically is it has these little tabs. I don't know if you can see these tabs. There's A, B, and C, and so forth. Those tabs, of course, were tabs for the time. You can't go to a store and buy tabs like that nowadays. So that in itself kind of marked the timing of it as being consistent. The 8 tabs each deal with some aspect of the program. The last tab is Project Environment, and it basically says that, let's see if I can see these words here. Project Environment says, when conditions become non-conducive for growth in our environment, and Washington cannot be influenced any further, the weather is lacking any precipitation. It should be wet. And the phrase wet implies blood and implies assassination. So this is a direct statement that Kennedy should be assassinated in that particular one. The other 7 items deal with other aspects of the secrecy leaking out. But the 8th one is the important one.
And I might further add that the context was around Kennedy wanting to share more information with the Russians about UFOs and what they call unknowns. And there's both a leaked document that talks about this, a part of the MJ-12 document, but there's also a document from the National Archives, a NASAM Memorandum 271 or 273 that that talks about Kennedy wanting to share more information with the Russians about unknowns. I think signed by Webb or directed to him. So there seems to be a nice confluence of external data and Majestic documents that support this hypothesis that Kennedy was trying to share more information with UFOs with the Russians, and that may be one of many reasons why he might have been assassinated. There's lots of theories. I think we just added another one.
Yes, I think that's a very important factor in the assassination. And yeah, that National Security Action Memorandum 271, that was actually signed on November 12, 10 days before the assassination. And on the same date, you actually have a top secret leaked document that was from John McCone, actually trying to deal with Kennedy's request to share all of the classified UFO files with the NSA and a long list of other US government agencies, which actually threatened opposing the entire operation. And in the handwriting, I think it was referring to James G. Angleton, the directives in responding to Kennedy, which to me is like smoking gun evidence that yes, it was this particular initiative of Kennedy to share UFO files with NASA, who in turn, according to National Security Action Memorandum 271, would be obliged to share them with the Soviet Union. That's what got Kennedy killed, or yeah, maybe that was the final factor, the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, well said, Michael. Your gold star for that discussion there.
Well, I did write a book about it, so hopefully some of that stuck. Kennedy's Last Stand definitely it puts all this together, and then and I think Bob's work on confirming the Burn Memo really is critical, and as you were saying, Linda Moulton Howe been holding up a lot of those documents, the 1954 SOM document, and I think she also refers again and again to the Burn Memo as an authentic document. So I certainly agree with that.
That's true. Yeah. One of the ways that Ryan and I became colleagues after we had these visits with Timothy Cooper and so forth, he became interested in doing some crash retrieval symposia in November of 2003. And so he had me be the first speaker on the symposium. Authenticating the Special Operations Manual was the first subject. So And then for the following 7 years, Ryan did another crash retrieval conference. And I think you might have been a speaker at one of those too, Michael, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it was at 2. I think I
Yep.
showed up at 2 of them.
Very,
Yeah.
very likely, yeah. So that's another way that Ryan and I became deeply involved in this subject together.
And I personally feel very proud of that work on those crash retrieval conferences, trying to give a voice and an opportunity to many other important investigators that did their work on different crash retrievals, and let them come and share their input and insights and data. And that was great. And I have a mental commitment to do 10 of them, so I have 3 left to go. But I'm busy right now. But we'll get to it.
One of the things that I've noticed with several of the documents, and this helps explain their being leaked, is that several of the Majestic documents are actually drafts. So maybe explain why it is that it's more likely that a draft can be leaked. A draft official document can be leaked as opposed to the final version in terms of security classifications and so forth. Why would a draft be more likely to be leaked?
Well, the timing of most of these documents occurs before we had electric typewriters. And so for the most part, these were actually typed with a manual typewriter. And there are people, we hired one of them, James Black, who specializes in identifying the typewriter from the images on the page. And so that was very important for the process.
Yeah, I might add that secretaries typing this, they make a mistake. It's not final. Somebody comes in and says, take this paragraph out, put in this next paragraph, and they unspool it out and put it in the trash or set it to the side and retype it. And or the carbon copies, these things are always done in duplicate or triplicate, things like that. And so there's lots of copies around there that secretaries may have had access to, or others that weren't as carefully controlled. But I think
that's very good point, because one of the first documents that Tim Cooper got was from the secretary to James Jesus Angleton. So that was the beginning of the entire load of documents that Tim got.
Mhm.
When we went to electronic reproduction, we don't seem to have, well, I think I'd be fair to say, most of our documents on our website are probably 90% of them are from typewriters, right, Ryan?
Yeah, that's true. Maybe a little higher, but I think that's why we don't see modern leaks today, because they're electronic and they get better and better at security all the time. And as soon as there started being leaks in the 80s, with Jamie Chanderay and the Eisenhower briefing document, I'm sure that the entire security apparatus for MJ12 got a lot more rigorous about protecting their information and people and personnel. I firmly believe that, the members of MJ12 probably aren't members very long, and they're under incredible electronic surveillance and video surveillance and weekly polygraph tests or monthly. They probably are underground most of the time. It's oppressive I would think, and let alone the sort of sci-fi-like claims of erasing people's memories. I wouldn't doubt that at all. I think there's some literature and some evidence of people working on propulsion systems and then, not asked to come to work anymore, and they can't remember where they worked, or what they did, or anything. And you don't know whether or not that's chemical warfare from the CIA's advanced efforts, or related, or ETs basically doing the Vulcan mind meld erasure process. I mean, I'm speculating, but there seems to be some evidence of people being deeply involved and then forgetting what they knew.
One of the
With respect to your question, Michael, the use of secretaries to do the typing often resulted in there being a rough draft that was never really corrected. And so some of these, for example, the one that was prepared for Einstein in 45, as I recall, I think that was probably, if you just look at the errors, you find the errors are associated with misunderstanding the word. And the typist just didn't know how to spell it. And so the correcting for the typist capability in interpreting and assessing all these documents, I think, is an important consideration.
And I might add also in the Einstein-Oppenheimer memo is that you imagine Einstein dictating it in a German accent to a secretary that maybe wasn't familiar with his language. But as far as the authenticity of that document goes, it's really rock solid, from language use to the forensic linguistic analysis done by independent people that we hired to look at it as well. So it's a conceptual piece, but it's very interesting read about what rights do aliens have to come visit Earth or take over Earth, or what does international law say about ETs and so forth. And it's thoughtful, as you'd expect from Einstein.
Yeah.
well,
The forensic linguistics is one of the things that I looked at from the point of view of whether Tim Cooper wrote some of these documents or whether they were written by someone else. So I was able to pretty much show, I think, that Tim Cooper was not one of the authors of these documents.
So I wonder, to what extent has there been some kind of official approval for some of the leaking of these documents? Starting with the 1984 Eisenhower briefing document being leaked. I mean, that was coincidental with the last member of the Majestic 12 group that was actually identified in the Eisenhower briefing document, and I think it was Jerome Hunsaker, if I recall correct, that he had just died, and so just after his death, then this Eisenhower briefing document is released, and of course all of the 12 members of the original Majestic 12 group are all dead. So that does suggest that there was some kind of official sanction given to allowing this document to come out. So to what degree do you think all of these Majestic documents that have been leaked have been done so with the approval of some officials that may even still be in positions of power?
Oh, well, I don't think that most of the documents we have were approved for leakage. I think essentially all of them we have were were provided to us by people who thought they were important enough for us to see, or for Tim Cooper to see, who they viewed as a way to get them sort of out. I personally don't think that MJ12 ever took a position that they should leak any documents to the public.
Right.
What do you think, Rand?
Yeah, I agree. What strikes me as prime evidence that there's no coordinated effort is the timing. I mean, you got leaks in 84 and 89 and 94 and 96 and 2001. And from all these different sources, there's different sources. There's like 7 or 8 different sources. Tim Cooper, responsible for several of them. You can consider Tim Cooper as a single source, but then again, if you talk to him, he said, no, the Cantwheel gave me this one, and this one came in the mailbox with this -1 on it. And this one came in the mailbox with the -2 on it. And it seemed like he was a member of the local American Legion. And so I think he was getting around. He had written Freedom of Information Act requests to Atomic Energy Commission, intelligence files, and he had put his name out into the universe as somebody that was really looking at it. And he had a father, Harry B. Cooper, who got an official commendation for his work on the UFO program from the Air Force,
Yeah.
signed by, I can't remember the general's name, but Tim Cooper had a military reputation, I think, by his father, who did hot lead printing presses and did printing, classified, top secret printing in Air Force Base, which is now in Colorado Springs. And so he had the chops and the interest, and I think that the people that were sympathetic to his interest chose him to provide or to receive these documents that were so important in their minds, particularly Cantwell, which is a pseudonym, that delivered a lot of these documents. So, and he was very impressionable too. I think there was a story that Tim recounted, which you may have published in your book, Michael, about his father, Harry, watching television and the assassination of Kennedy and putting his head in his hands and said, "Oh my God, they really did it." And Tim is 10 years old at this time, and it made an impression on him. So I just, too many different sources, too much time, bad for counterintelligence and attracting attention. No official leaking that I can see at all. It just would be a bad effort. Very negative.
So I guess we don't really agree with your hypothesis there, Michael.
Okay, no problem. I can live with that. So it sounds as though it's just been a very kind of uncoordinated, just a lot of people with conscience that had access to these documents and decided that they would run the risk and use these documents. And you mentioned Cantwell, and you mentioned Source S, but I remember they talked about the mysterious death of William Colby, and that was actually a result of I think the Burn Memo being released. The consequence for these documents out that the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, William Colby, was actually killed because he was mentioned in that document, and if he were to be asked a question, he could have confirmed the reality of that particular Burn Memo.
That's interesting. I'd forgotten that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look up the official cause of death, it was drowning and was ruled a suicide or accidental rather than a murder. But, hey, it's the director of Central Intelligence, and it just takes one Navy SEAL swimming out underneath this canoe to flip him over and drown him and be done with it. It could very easily have been a murder too.
So I know on your website, you have a lot of documents that are divided historically, and then you have a page of sources. So is there anything you kind of want to say about the website that people that might be visiting it for the first time should be on the lookout for? Where do they start?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'd recommend to just start with the Special Operations Manual as a way to go to one of the strongest ones. And then if there's something specific, every document has a little abstract about it. Then if something catches your eye in the abstract, you can read the whole document, and the document may be 1 page or maybe 30 pages. But there's snapshots of what the documents talk about and their authenticity. So I would just start with the Special Operations Manual and then it's a whole dedicated website called specialoperationsmanual.com that specializes in just that document specifically, and all its questions about, well, it's a fake because, or it's real because, and it walks the reader through it.
Yeah. This contents of this book in the back is probably what's in the back.
And there's lots of write-ups. So that's the best starting point for people that want to orient themselves. But we specialize in documents, or I specialize in documents and crashes, and my dad specializes in just documents. Others in the UFO field specialize in different areas.
Well, I think the leaked documents are very significant, because I know that others do specialize in documents that come through the system. And these can be very helpful, but what I found is that documents that are released officially through the FOIA system tend to be kind of like dealing with minutia and kind of superficial in terms of these broader issues that we've been discussing. And if you really want to get deep into understanding what's been happening, you've got to dive into the Majestic Documents website and just go through those documents and the books and the conference reports that you've got there linked up on the site.
Yep, I couldn't agree more, Michael. It's a great way to get to the sort of jugular of what's going on. It's certainly been a primary resource for Hollywood and their efforts in all manner of addressing the alien issue and talking about it. And that's great that they're doing that.
Well, we've kind of entered a new era now, and just kind of bringing the interview to a close. That now you actually have the Pentagon and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence setting up a UAP or UFO office. You have them giving reports now to Congress, and the latest development is that NASA has actually set up a study group to investigate UFO reports. So, given these developments, do you think in this new, more permissive environment that the Majestic Documents can actually take a much more prominent role in introducing people to the depth of what's been happening over the last 70 years?
You want to try that, Dad, or you want me to?
Well, you start.
Okay. I think there'll be some interest on the periphery. I think that the congressional efforts, the NASA efforts, the Pentagon efforts are all what I call blue book-like, lights in the sky, except updated, better video, better cameras, etc. They're not cleared or to access any of the crash data or the extraterrestrial data. Unfettered access for weeks on end in Area 51, going wherever they want, or unfettered access to Vault 631 at the National Archives, with 3 or 4 guys looking at all this stored data, which they haven't gone through to figure out historically what's going on. So I think that although they're going to have a lot of fun, and they're going to look at, it's like Skinwalker Ranch, they're putting up fancy sensors and, trying to find new information about gravity control or magnetic fields or shape-shifting UFOs and all that stuff. It's fine. I mean, it's been done before. It's just they haven't seen pictures of it or evidence of it. And the heart of the matter is the biological entities, the crashed UFOs, the reverse engineering, the technology that's been gleaned from reverse engineering. That's the meat. These guys are going to be playing with vegetables for years on end, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, I would say that the people who are going to be testifying really don't know the real story. The only people who know the real story are the ones who read Michael's last 3 books, and the people who he talks with. The sophistication of the interaction between the different civilizations about the moon, Antarctica, and Mars is so critical, I think, and you're not going to hear any of that, I think, in the testimonies in Congress. So that's my view, is that everybody ought to read your books, Michael.
Yeah.
And of course, the William Tompkins books that we've been working on, that have the volume 3 has just come out.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just got an email this morning from somebody who said, why wasn't Bill Tompkins' book submitted to Congress as an official book, like a couple of other books have been submitted. And I said, well, do you want to do that? And so, I mean, it's possible that we could try to put that book in as a official report that could be recorded somehow in the congressional record. But I don't know whether it would really mean anything or not.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Anything that you're working on now? I mean, are there any kind of documents that might make their way onto the Majestic Documents website, and any other kind of projects that both of you are working on? Maybe Ryan, and then we finish with Bob.
Okay.
Well, I certainly have an action item to go put this DIA manual, or not manual, but document and an abstract of it up on the website, and I'll have my webmaster go do that. I've just been putting it off, but certainly that. I think I'm not really doing much in the UFO field right now. I've been preoccupied running a different company, working on fusion. So it's the technology that's, the critical issue is, in politics, it's the economy stupid. In UFOs, it's the technology stupid. It's all about the technology. And if NASA isn't working on the technology, if they aren't working on gravity control, and how do you do faster than light space travel, or how do you do fusion in a more effective way. It's clear that UFOs don't run on kerosene, and that Ben Rich said many years ago that we've figured out how to take ET home. So in theory, somebody figured out anti-gravity back in the 80s. And
Right.
the question is, who knows that? Find them, recreate it. Go, go spend $100 million on bright people researching this in an earnest way. And if you apply money and resources, you make progress. And one of the great control mechanisms, I believe, has been to deliberately not fund a lot of promising research that would focus on gravity control research. And you see hints here and there, but they often get squashed. Or do we really think Maxwell's equations are right? Or is there something wrong here? Do they not deal with current and induction correctly? Inertia is still sort of a weird anomaly. It's all about the science. And that's what I think the message from the ETs to humanity is. We crashed these UFOs here because it was convenient, junkyard Earth. But in the meantime, you guys, you better figure out how these work, because you're not smart enough. We have a brain capacity that's 100 times humans in bandwidth and intelligence, and you need to figure out how to get there so you can get out of this warring planet and clean up your act with nuclear and all the sort of inhumanity of man to man. So that was my soapbox perspective.
Yeah, that's good. I guess I would add that your point about emphasizing the technology is very consistent with Michael's point that there's 6,000 patents that have been classified, and in those 6,000 patents, we very well might find the secret to fusion, but lots of other things, that anti-gravity and time travel, all those things that we think we don't know how to do.
Yeah. Now there's a leak potential for you. Some investigative reporter should find and interview 30 of former U.S. Patent Office employees that used to work in the classified section and see what they have to say, particularly the ones that are on their deathbed or near there that don't care. They just want the truth to come out, that have some moral fiber or character.
Creative suggestion.
Hey, give me $1 million, I'll go do that, or somebody else will. I mean, there's so much work to be done. It's just surprising.
Well, I want to thank you both for coming on the show and giving us your credible information. I truly think that the work you've both done on the Majestic Documents and authenticating them and making them available to the general public is really invaluable. And one day I would definitely nominate you for the Nobel Peace Prize for sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks so much.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.